Okay, good morning. This is a video just walking those who are considering purchasing and putting the Roadlok wheel security system on their bikes. Just a little vid showing the different components of the product and how to install it. I've previously done a video on the Roadlok, but that was when it was in situ and that was just walking through the operation of it. As I've now bought the KTM, I'm transferring the product from my BMW over to the KTM, so I'm just going to walk you through that briefly. So let me just walk you through the different components. So the main part is of course the Roadlok itself. So this is an alloy billet single piece component. The product is actually made in America. When I bought this, I could only ship it from America, but now there's a UK distributor on hand, which is great. You don't have to pay the import duties and all the various taxes. So this product actually sits on the bike, and as you can see here, this groove here is where the brake disc fits. And the simple process for operation is that you have this retracting spring-loaded high tensile steel bolt. It passes into here with the brake disc passing through here, and as the wheel rotates, this will locate itself in one of the ventilation holes on the disc, spring shut, and that will lock the product into place and lock the wheel disc in a secure, stable position. Unlike the disc locks themselves, which you lock to the bike, but then if someone tries to walk away with the bike, push it, ride it, what have you, the only stopping mechanism on a standard brake disc lock is actually when the disc lock itself jams against the caliper. Now that's going to damage your caliper, potentially damage your disc, and cause mayhem. The beauty of this is because the ventilation hole is in effect the anchor point, the wheel in the first place doesn't rotate once it's locked. So all that happens when someone tries to ride the bike away is that it will stall, or someone tries to push the bike away, there's no way they're going to do so unless they want, unless they're in a position to lift it. So in here you've got the lock, you have a key for that, you unlock it to remove this and lock it obviously to walk away, and this will stay on the bike, obviously with the yellow tape there to sort of remind you to remove it before you walk away. When you're actually riding the bike, to prevent dust and grime getting in here, you have a locking plate, and again, as with the bolt, this literally just sits in, you lock it in, and that provides some defence from various sort of debris getting into here. As you can see, it's a pretty stable product. Very, very light. I'm not sure what the exact weight is, but a number of people ask me about the weight, because obviously it affects the unsprung weight of the wheel. It's extremely light, but also extremely strong. These two bolts here are where it's located to the caliper, and I'll show you later actually how that fits, but the package itself comes with a variety of different bolts, different bolt sizes, and a variety of spacers, and these spacers are there to compensate for the extra depth that this has when applied to the caliper, hence the need for different length bolts. And when you buy the product, you just specify the bike and the model you have, and they will send out the appropriate spacers and bolts accordingly. One thing that you need to be aware of is that this Roadlok comes in either a right hand or a left hand. I've obviously gone for the right hand model because it just seemed to suit me, especially when the bike's on its side stand and leans across. It's more accessible. If you have it on the left hand side, it seems to be against the sort of the fall of the bike when it's on its side stand, so I just felt that this was the better option moving forward. So yeah, so they're the various components, and I'll show you now how I come to install it. Okay, so here we are about to start the install of the Roadlok product. Two things to mention before we start. It's strongly recommended that before we start unscrewing any caliper bolts, make sure that the front brake lever is pulled in and cable tied off. The logic there being that once you remove the bolts here from the caliper will stay in the same position on the bike, and you won't have to actually, you know, sort of have an extra pair of hands or extra precautions to keep the caliper safe. So with the grip on the disc, that will keep that in position so you can work away to your heart's content without disturbing anything. And only the other thing to mention is, if you're putting the Roadlok on the right hand side, just make sure the bike is on the stand with the front wheel turned to the left. It just gives you better access to when you come to do the install. Okay, so what tools do you need to do this job? Literally 3 tools. You need a set of Allen keys, because the bolts on the Roadlok tend not to be of the Torx variety, where a lot of the bikes have Torx bolts. The BMW had, and the KTM I'm sure also has. Socket set, obviously, to move forward. A tape measure, and the tape measure's here because you need to measure to ensure that the shims that you put in are spacer shims with the longer bolts that are provided by the Roadlok are the right ones, to make sure that your caliper bolts are going in the right depth into the bike. Yeah. And in addition, an important tool here is the torque wrench. This is critical. This it's something I've invested in over the last year or two. I tended to do work on the bike without really putting too much thought into the torque settings of the bolts. I've come to realise through talking to people and people's other experience of over tightening and under tightening certain bolts, it can actually damage the bike, and potentially with some of the alloy materials that are on bikes these days, the point at which the alloy becomes weak is actually quite critical, if indeed you're sort of over tightening them. So the torque wrench here is important. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just remove completely these 2 caliper bolts. On this bike, which is the KTM Super Duke GT, these are T45 torque sockets, so literally just snap them off. Okay, as you can see, the caliper stays in position now because the handbrake is on. Well, the handbrake, but the front brake is on. And as you can see here, these bolts are they about 40-50 millimeters long, a lot shorter than they were on the BMW, hence why you get the different bolts for the different model of bike. So now they're released, we can start to think about presenting the Roadlok onto the caliper. But the first thing we need to do, and it might need 1 or 2 or maybe more attempts just to get the right spacer length, but that's really the only tricky part of this installation. So just to give you an idea about how this Roadlok presents itself to the bike, obviously with the groove here, it goes around the brake disc, and as you can see here, this is where the Roadlok is secured to the caliper, and the shims or spacers go in here to make sure they have the proper fit. Now, depending on how far out this Roadlok is installed to the caliper, as you'll see, it obviously moves in and out on the disc, and getting the right spacer length is critical, because if you don't get it lined up with one of these holes as it rotates, it can be a bit hit and miss as to where that goes in. On the BMW, I actually thought I had the right spacer in, and it would present itself into the holes when you rotated the bike, but it took a bit of movement. You might have had to roll it forward 3 or 4 times just to get it to click in, but it was literally a millimetre out. I changed the spacers to a different spacer, all of which are provided in the pack, and I just adjusted it by 1 millimetre, and it went in perfectly every time into these holes. So you're literally looking at moving the bike no more than 3 or 4 inches, worst. On occasions it just pops straight in, but it's important to get these shims at the right length. Okay, so what have we got here? So what I've done, I've taken out the 2 KTM bolts, and with the pack, with the Roadlok, I had this pair of bolts and this pair of bolts. obviously one is shorter than the other, so I've elected to go for the shorter one in the first instance. And what I've done, I've put the bolt through the caliper. I have the washer here and the spacer here. Now that on both of these is getting close to the distance or the length of the standard bolt. Obviously what I'll need to do is make sure that not only the bolt doesn't go in too deep into the female thread on the caliper, but also that I'm using the right length of shims. And as you can sort of see here, well, you may not be able to see too well, there is a slight difference in the length of the various shims. Now these are all in different pairs, there's about 3 different lengths, but they only differ by about 0.5 millimetre to 1 millimetre compared to each one, so it's important you get the right ones. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to present this into the caliper and just test as to whether this appears to be the right length for me. And what I'll also do, I'll also use the tape measure to actually make sure that the bolts aren't going in too far or too short. But from a visual here, I can see that the bolts I'm going to use are about 1 or 2 millimeters shorter than the OEM bolts. I'm sure that won't be a problem. It's more a problem if the bolts are too long. Okay, on to the next phase. Okay, so as you can see here, I've literally just presented the caliper and the Roadlok together. I haven't screwed the bolts in at all, but what I have done, I've put the bolt in with a little washer and then a spacer. Now another tip on this from doing this second time round is that I wouldn't put any Loctite or any of the thread lock adhesives on the bolts just yet. I would do all the installation and make sure you're happy with it, and then it's an easy case of just unbolting the caliper bolts, pulling some of the thread lock in, and then sort of torquing them back up. So just a little bit of advice there from me doing this second time round. So I'm just literally going to thread these bolts in. I'm not going to torque them up, I'm just going to do them pinch tight, and then I'm going to start to see whether the spacers are in the right position with the retracting bolt, spring-loaded bolt, just to see whether this is the right setup from the get-go. I'll be lucky if I've got it right first time, but then it's just a case of changing the spacers with the different sizes, just checking the measurements again, and just making sure it's a perfect fit. Okay, so I've now centered the Roadlok up to the calipers and I've tightened up with a size 8 Allen key. The bolts coming with the Roadlok aren't Torx head bolts, hence the need for the Allen keys. So the next job now is in effect to release the front brake, and I'm going to put the retracting security bolt in, and then I'm going to just see whether it's in the right position. Okay, so I'm just going to show you quickly how to put the bolt in. So just to remind you, so this is the spring-loaded bolt. You put the key in, move it in the clockwise direction fully, which opens the lock. You push it in and then close it off and it's locked. Now I heard then, what I felt was the bolt going straight through the hole. I don't know if you heard that click. So I could be highly lucky and it could have been already perfectly presented, the right depth so that this is in the right sort of position across the face of the disc, and I was just coincidentally right on top of one of the ventilation holes. If that's the case, that's a stroke of luck. But anyway, all I'm going to do now is take the cable tie off the brake and move the bike and check that it's locked in. Okay, so this is where it gets a little fiddly. So I've just tried the Roadlok and I've had these longest shims and spacers put in, but it wasn't locating actually in the holes on the disc. So what I'm going to do now, and as you can see, hopefully the camera will pick it up, each of those pairs of shims are smaller by, you know, 1 millimeter at most each, and this is where the trial and error comes in. So I'm now going to try actually not the next size but the second size down, and I'm going to present it back up to the bike and again just see if it fits nicely. So a bit of a trial and error. I'm not going to video me trying the different ones, that'll be no value whatsoever, but you get the principle and the idea behind measuring up to this. Okay, so let's see if I've got the right one. So I'm just going to push the locking pin in, lock it into position. I'm just going to rock the bike forward or backwards, and if I hear a click, it'll be the pin going through the ventilation hole, and that's sort of confirming that it's seating in nicely. Oh. There you go. I didn't even have to move it more than a couple of millimeters and it clicked in nicely. So there you go. So that's the Roadlok working on my KTM Super Duke GT. That wheel now will not move. If someone tries to steal the bike with the pin in and they try to ride it away, all that's going to happen is it's going to stall the engine. But there'll be no damage to the disc, no damage to the caliper, and hopefully the would-be thief pegs it. So anyway, hopefully the video's been useful. I highly recommend this. I think it's good quality build, nice and light so it doesn't affect the dynamics of the bike, and the beauty for me is it's always on the bike, so you're not having to carry a bulky disc lock in your pocket in the storage space on the bike, and it's always with you. All you're carrying around is this pin. Okay, hopefully that's been useful. Catch you soon, guys. Keep safe and enjoy your riding. Bye bye now.